Good evening on the Caribbean side of the world and good night in the Netherlands part of the world. Welcome to another installment or session of Korean BIJ1, an unequal kingdom. Today, of course, I'm here again, Lysanne Charles, candidate number 13 on BIJ1, and I'm joined by candidate number 2, Quinsy Gario. And also today we're joined by 4 individuals from across the kingdom or across the Dutch part of the kingdom, so to speak. We have Mr. Raymond Jessurun of the Anti-Poverty Platform on St. Maarten. We have Jonathan van Arneman of St. Maarten as well. Urisha Blake over on Sint Eustatius. And of course, somebody I know for a bit, Dimetri Whitfield from Saba. And today we're going to be discussing a few things, including constitutional affairs and self-determination. What does that mean for us as islanders, anti-racism and education, inclusion and participation. And then even within there, we'll touch on stuff like poverty, social minimums, climate justice, and just really have a frank conversation about what that means to us, Dutch Caribbean people. Where are their questions? As I indicated to the guests prior, I think it's not that Quinsy and I are actually trying to convince people to vote for us, even though, of course, we would love if they do. But we really just want to have a platform to have a conversation about what it is like to live on the Caribbean part of the kingdom, and for the best islanders, the Caribbean part of the Netherlands. So having said that, I'm just going to give everybody a chance to introduce themselves. And I will start with Jonathan, because you're over on my left. So if you will go ahead and just tell people who you are, a little bit about yourself, and what are some of the pressing things that you want to bring to the table?
Sure. So my name is Jonathan Benarman. I'm 27 years old. I grew up in Sint Maarten, but I lived abroad for 9 years. So in Sint Maarten, it's quite common that after high school, you go abroad either to the Netherlands or to France or to the UK or to the US to further your studies. And so I spent 2 years in Canada after graduating high school, and then I spent 7 years in Minnesota. So I was gone for a period of 9 years. But I recently came back to March 2019, right before the pandemic. I've been here ever since. Um, since I've returned, I have been um, the artist in residence at the National Institute of Arts, and there I have worked with several schools on the island as a dance teacher. So I teach dance, and I also am a choreographer. I also was one of the co-founders of Melee, a conversation on Sint Maarten history, and that is a podcast where 4, I guess you could say, young Sint Maarteners, we decided to answer a lot of questions about Sint Maarten history that we have that we figured other people might have as well. So we created a whole podcast platform around that. And so you can follow us on LASXM on both Facebook and Instagram, the other platforms. And then I'm the incoming director, or sorry, incoming president of State SXM. And that's rather new. But again, something very dear to my heart. That's the intro.
Okay, great. I think there's a little cracking in your mic, Jonathan. So if you just adjust that a little bit, if you can, that would be great. The next person that I have is Urisha Blake. So if you can just go ahead, introduce yourself to people, let them know a little bit about you, that would be excellent.
Hi everyone, my name is Urisha Blake. I am from the beautiful island of St. Eustatius. I was born and raised here. I moved to the Netherlands in 2012 to study teaching. I graduated in 2016. I'm a teacher now, and I worked there. Well, I'm still currently working there. The difference is due to the pandemic, I get to spend time in the sun and still teach online. And I'm currently working here on Stacia as an educational consultant as well. And I also work at a reading program called Gateway to Success, where we help children who have difficulties with not only reading, but language issues. We help them and we try to get them on the right path, because we understand that education is the gateway to success, and knowledge begins with books. So that is a little bit what I do on the professional side. I want to call myself a little bitty baby activist. I just started. I am a person who's very vocal. I try as much as possible to make as much noise as I can about things that I want to see change. So for me, during 2020, one of my biggest problems here in St. Eustatius was the water issue, and I made a lot of noise until the camera heard me in an interview with the ombudsman and the current governor thingamajig on station. Um, we can talk about that soon. But
Yes.
yeah, I am a person, I try to change things as much as I can for the better.
Okay, great. So next, we have Dimitri. You're the next person in my view. So maybe you can go ahead and introduce yourself, let people know a little bit about you.
Sorry about that. I just had some
That's
issues
okay.
on myself. But hi, everybody. I am Dimetri Whitfield. I was born on Curacao. I've been all over the place. I was born in Curacao. I grew up in Saba until I left for further education. I lived on Barbados for 4 years. And then I moved to the Netherlands for 2 years. I've lived in Germany. I've lived in the Gambia, West Africa. And right now I am working as a journalist in Sint Maarten. So some of the issues that really are on the forefront of my mind are decolonization and what that really means, and how we can achieve this in a practical way. And more closer to home is the skyrocketing cost of living, which goes hand in hand with recruiting our qualified individuals to come back to the islands to help us develop further. Um, and I guess with that, I will pass it back to you, Lysanne.
Okay, great. And then finally, we have Mr. Raymond Jessurun up top there in my screen. Maybe you can go ahead and introduce yourself to the viewers.
Thank you for inviting me in this panel of BIJ1. And I'm a senior citizen. As I tell everybody, I'm an Antillian. I was born in Curacao. I did my school and education in Curacao and later left 16 years old to the university in the Netherlands. And I became a sociologist. Since then, I have been working for the government of the Netherlands Antilles. And in that capacity, I have been on all the islands providing our services from the ministry. I'm a Christian social activist. And with that said, actually a human rights defender for workers' rights. I have been in the union since I came back to work in the Ministry of Education, Culture, Youth and Sports. That was the largest civil servants union, the APFO. And I'm also for the last 14 years defender of the rights of senior citizens. And I made a distinction between seniors and pensioners because I became a pensioner when, due to the austerity measures of the government, I was one of the first that had to leave the government from the Netherlands Antilles. And so I went on pension very early pension. And as we talk about poverty today, we talk about old age pension. So I had still to wait when I left for my old age pension, which I'm already enjoying now for 10 years. And then I'm a defender for the rights of the persons with dementia. And saying all of that, in St. Maarten, that was also what Lysanne said. I'm the co-coordinator of the St. Maarten Anti-Poverty Platform, where social organizations in St. Maarten have joined, and that is already for some 8 years now, and where we address the poverty in our islands for our households and for the people that we represent through our organizations. And so I will be happy to contribute tonight to the discussion about inequality in the kingdom, and especially matters that here in our part of the kingdom have been observed by us and addressed by us.
Yeah, correct. Okay, and then finally, Quincy, number two on Bay Aim, but go ahead and share a little bit about yourself before we dive into the conversation.
I think I like that description of being an Antillian. I have a little bit of the same story. Born on Curacao, raised partly in the Netherlands, partly on Sint Maarten, and now been living in the Netherlands since I came to study in 2002. I actually came to do a media studies background, and I ended up actually going more into post-colonial studies and gender studies, and then doing a lot of work on stage. So I'm a performance poet by trade, you can say, and then became a visual artist. And as I was doing that, I also became a bit of a troublemaker, as some people see me in the country. And I think what was important for me when thinking of where we are now in terms of time, in terms of the development of the Netherlands, in terms of the relationship with the islands, as 2020 barreled on us, I kept thinking about like 10 years earlier and 10, 10, 10, and what was actually supposed to happen, and a decade later, and what happened to all of those promises from back then. And so joining a party like BIJ1 for me was a way of thinking through how to get back to that spirit of self-determination and how to think about decolonization. I think it was Dimetri who said, in practical ways. What are the steps that we need to take? So I'm really, really happy to be part of this panel. Lysanne, thanks a lot for putting this together. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation going forward.
Okay, and just a quick introduction of myself. I like to tell people I wear many, many hats. Right now, I'm sort of on a sabbatical. I do a couple of projects with the school and young people, with the after school and Saba, also for the kids and with the leaders. But really, I'm focusing or meant to focus on my poetry and writing a novel that I'm busy with, which is a historical fiction. I like to consider myself a historian. I'm very much interested in the history of Saba in particular, but also in the history of the Dutch Caribbean in particular, but the history that has been erased, because I feel like there's parts of who we are that just sort of vanished, or if they are there, they're not accessible to us, and I would like for us to sort of reclaim those things. I'm also an activist. I've been busy with feminists, with LGBT, with race relations for the last 20, 25 years. And for the last 4 years, I've been living back on Saba. Prior to that, I was living on St. Maarten for the longest time. And I've also been like all around the world. So studied in Holland, studied in the US, studied in Curacao. And I like to say, as Quincy said in a previous program, that I'm a child of the Caribbean, because definitely, like Mr. Jessurun, I felt like, I was an Antillian. I went sleep an Antillian one day and woke up a St. Martiner, but also a Saban by origins. But I think I'm also a Caribbean child because I have deep roots in Dominica, Montserrat, St. Kitts. So, like really all over the place. And I'd like to think also in this discussion how we can actually look at ourselves as Caribbean people as well. And how do we balance that being people who are part of a kingdom, the Dutch kingdom, and yet very much so part of an archipelago, the Caribbean region. And what does that mean to us? So those conversations about identity and history, all of those things are important to me. And I think, as people know, for me, one of the main reasons that I'm on BIJ1 is because I found myself very much so in the conversations around deconstructing the colonial legacy, which I feel like we don't talk about enough. The ways in which the way that the kingdom started way back in colonial times, and the way it then continued to develop even up until 1954, the ways in which that continues to impact opportunity, access, power, in the relationships between the kingdom partners today. So that's why I'm here on Bay and I feel like these are things that we have to talk about, we have to unpack. And if we don't do it now, I feel like with the rise of the right in the Netherlands, we won't have enough opportunities to talk about it in the future. So having said that, I'm gonna open the floor a bit. And one of the pressing things that I think I want to talk about is what are the ways in which inequality manifests in the kingdom. And I think we're going to talk about that for like about 10 minutes, maybe 50 minutes. I know everybody has a lot of different maybe questions that they want to pose also to myself and Quinsy or things that they want to share. But I would like for each of you to just say like, what are the ways in which you see inequality manifesting in the parts of the kingdom that you are living on?
Can I begin?
Yes, go ahead. Go ahead.
Awesome. I think the biggest thing for me, personally, and then as a woman and as a woman of color, and then as a woman who studied and all of the things that I am, the biggest thing I see is wage gaps between European Netherlands and Dutch Caribbean. Mind-boggling, truly, how little money people make here on St. Eustatius and by definition everywhere else in the Dutch Caribbean. I cannot reconcile how it's possible that my mother, my cousins are significantly older than I am, and yet I make more money simply because I work in the Netherlands. It does not make sense. And it's not a currency thing, because I understand currencies. It's literally, they say, no, you can't make this amount of money. And then and another thing that is wild to me is the starters in the Netherlands, the white starters or the European starters and the Antillean Surinamese starters, sometimes against the Surinamese starters. All the Black people are essentially, pardon my French, screwed from the jump. We have to get a high student loan because let's face it, our parents have bad salaries down here, so they can't even afford to save for us to go to school, especially if you have more than one child. So the wages are so low that yeah, our child has to get a high student loan, and they don't have the, lovely idea of let me go home to mom to wash my clothes, or let me go to the fridge and raid the fridge, because no, if you don't have it, you don't have it. So we start with this extreme student loan and this debt that we're gonna have until we're 40 if we're lucky, and not further. So we won't be able to buy property properly, and we won't be able to have all the things that are necessary. So we're putting our children in a hole now, because I'm 25 and I'm 27, I mean, and I should start thinking about having kids, they say. And now I have to say, well, I have such a high student loan, so I have to put off having children until that. White people don't have to do that. That was my point. That is a big gap for me.
Okay. We're going to come back to that. Anyone else? I see Mr. Jessurun, you have your mic off already, so you want to go ahead and tune in.
Oh, well, apart from the gaps that we see in wages and loans for students, social security. Um, so when we talk about old age pensions, we talk about minimum wage, we talk about what people have to get when they are unemployed, unemployment benefits, social allowances, you name it. We can go into those details and provide figures for you to see the big gap.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
actually, um, let's put it this way. If we all are more knowledgeable about our rights, and we all knowledgeable about what economic, social, and cultural rights we have, then I cannot understand that we continue to leave them with providing us with these gaps.
Mm-hmm.
I give the latest 10 years of the best islands, Bonaire, Statia, and Saba. Their expectation was that they would have been getting the same social security as in the Netherlands, and until today, nothing about that. I don't even talk yet about Sint Maarten, Curacao, and Aruba, where it is less than what it is in the Netherlands and less than what it is in Bonaire Station and Saba. So if we talk about we have equal rights in the kingdom, we talk about we have equal economic, social, and cultural rights in the kingdom. Far from that in our part of the kingdom. Even when we look at the ones that have moved and migrated to the Netherlands, yeah, because of their background, because they are Antilleans, the discrimination continues in what they can get and how they can continue to develop themselves in the kingdom. So I agree with Urisha.
Okay. Okay, great. Dimitri?
Yeah, I was just unmuting my mic itself because when you pose the question about how inequality manifests itself in the kingdom, I just immediately started jotting down cost of living, but also the lack of social benefits in relation to cost of living. And I'm not sure about the best islands or all the best islands, but we have yet to set a standard of what a living wage is.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
that in combination with the wage gap, like Urisha said, is I think one of the most pressing ways that our economic opportunities are hampered in the Dutch Caribbean. And
Yeah.
everybody in my age, we are tasked with tens of thousands of dollars in student debt. And I believe the current study system was designed in a dream for the future that doesn't exist anymore. The dream of our parents of going to school, getting a degree, coming back, getting a good job, and making your life off of that, buying a house, settling down, having a family. That
Mm-hmm.
dream no longer exists. It doesn't match up with our current reality. And I
Right.
think we should have a conversation of how we can overcome this in layman's terms.
Right, right, right. Okay, thank you. And Jonathan?
Sure. So I definitely agree with everything that was said. So are you guys hearing me okay now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything that was said so far. I think everyone is definitely hitting the nail on the head. There's a lot of gaps. Like, I mean, honestly, any part of life you could think about, like, there's a gap. There's a gap in education that we talk about, like how there's so much more resources in school in the Netherlands versus in the Caribbean. The type of education that you have access to, and the opportunities that allow themselves, like even for special education needs, and there's so many special education kids that don't have access to proper schooling, and they're just thrown in with everyone else. They're really put at a disservice because of that. The banking system on the islands is horrendous, absolutely horrendous. To get proper loans, to get a proper mortgage, to get decent service, it
Mm-hmm.
took 3 months to open a bank account. Like it is rough. It is rough
Yeah,
out here.
it is.
Crazy. The customer service is insane. It's just there's so much red tape with everything. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but I have a question that I wanted to ask because, just in the spirit of inclusion, we mentioned the 1954 date. Uh, so Lisanne mentioned the 1954 date, and then Quincy mentioned, um, the disappointment after what was supposed to happen in 2010. And so I was
Mm-hmm.
wondering if you both could expand on that a little bit. Like, what happened in 1954? But for people watching, like what changed in 1954? What is that changing point that happened? And then what was supposed to change in 2010, and what did
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Quincy, before I let you take it, because I know you've explained this very, very well, I just wanted to say, like, also for me, one of the things that is mind-boggling to me as a person who's lived in the Netherlands and also lived on the islands and on Saba now is the really high indeed cost of living. And I really wonder sometimes, like, how do people make it? You know what I mean? From month to month, like shopping is incredibly expensive. You go in, like, literally, sometimes $25 can get you like four things, if that. You know what I mean? Like everything is super expensive. And then on top of that, indeed, like, I will say Urisha made a good point that there is this perception, and often it's not just perception, that there is a sort of inequality in how you get opportunities or access to opportunities as a Caribbean Dutch person and a European Dutch person, like someone coming from the Netherlands to work on the islands, that there's much more, they're much more able to negotiate for what they want, to get better salaries. And so for me, because like when we have these conversations, people often go like, oh, so y'all are anti-Dutch, or oh, y'all are anti-Europeans. And I'm like, no, that is not the conversation that at least I am trying to have, or I think most people try to have. We're trying to say like, how can we look at this thing objectively and say, how do you even the playing field for all people involved? Because there is something wrong here, and that there are people who are getting disgruntled, and sometimes, often, rightfully so, because of these inequalities. And for me, that's one of the reasons why they said, okay, let me run for the second chamber, because I want us to have these very important conversations. And then, of course, that trickles right on up to ideas around um, so the pension and AOV. But what also makes me sometimes intrigued is when people then go like, yeah, but actually, these are responsibility of the island. So you guys should figure those things out. And then I feel like there is often this catch-22 about accountability and responsibility, and there's no real way to have the conversation in a way that doesn't become antagonistic right away, if you understand what I'm saying. And yet we have to have these conversations, because if we do not have these conversations, the inequalities will continue, and then we're not getting any further either, right? So that's one. But I'm going to let Quinsy answer Jonathan's question, and then I will answer it as well.
I think when thinking about those two dates, 1954 and 2010, I think there comes an understanding of self-determination and what that means. And I think 1954 also cannot be seen without thinking about 1949, because 1949 is when Indonesia gained its independence officially, according to the documents from the Netherlands. And that's the point where the Netherlands, after spending all of the Marshall money, the Marshall help money that it got from the US to actually fight off the Indonesians from getting their independence, they were then forced to think about like, hey, if we want to be part of the UN, we no longer get to have colonies. And so they were actually forced to sign a document with all the territories around the world, which up to that point had been called colonies. And supposedly we were no longer colonies. And so you had Suriname, you had the Netherlands Antilles, and you had West Papua at that time. Now, in 62, West Papua was given to Indonesia. And in 75, Suriname fought and got its independence after the uprising in 1969 on Curacao. And I think a lot of people forget as well that in 1973, when the government building burned down in Sint Maarten, it was also connected to that uprising in 1969. I think a lot of people really need to read Friendly Anger, because that book is really, really helpful in charting what exactly was going on in Sint Maarten and the Leeward Islands in that period. So you get this sense of 1969, 1973. 1975 is actually the date in official documents in The Hague that we are no longer called colonies. From 1954 until 1975, we were still being referred to as colonies in official documents, even though we were no longer that. 1986 comes around, Aruba leaves the Dutch Antilles. And then there is a whole lot of voting going on because the islands within themselves are finding it's unworkable. Different cultures of communication, different languages spread out over the 6 islands, at that point 5 islands, and so working together becomes a bit more difficult. Of course, what also happens is that the Dutch are really, really good in using divide and conquer tactics, giving one island a certain amount of power to then rule over the other islands. And then instead of it being all of the islands together against or fighting for each other, it becomes the islands fighting amongst each other for a couple of scraps that are thrown our ways, to put it a bit more disrespectfully in that sense. Then what you get is a voting whereby Curacao and Sint Maarten vote to leave the Netherlands Antilles and get a one-to-one direct connection with the Netherlands. The same thing as what Aruba has. Bonaire actually votes to stay in the Netherlands Antilles in opposition to all of the other islands. It wasn't Bonaire. Which
St.
island was it?
Eustatius, St.
Was
It was
St.
Eustatius.
us.
Eustatius?
It was us. We
Yeah,
wanted
it
them
was
Ah.
to
St.
leave.
Eustatius,
It was
yes.
us.
But I think Bonaire also had a couple of issues going on
No,
because
Bonaire and Saba, they decided that they wanted to be integrated. The exact thing that we
Municipalities,
have
yes.
now, that's
Yes.
what they decided. Only
Yeah.
Stacia had Stacia.
I,
Uh-huh.
I've also
Go ahead.
people on Bonaire actually didn't really want to participate in the voting, and so in that
Right,
sense,
exactly.
you get the point that they didn't really participate, and so by default it happened. And I think that's what's been causing a lot of the issues as well at the moment, because instead of 2010 being this moment of self-determination for Sint Maarten, for Curacao, it became a moment when actually the Dutch government and the cabinets that we got here at that time pounced. And they used, or let me use a term that Naomi Klein uses, and that's disaster capitalism. They saw that this was the moment was ripe to come in and push through neoliberal reforms. And the same thing happened after Hurricane Irma on St. Maarten. The same thing is happening now with the pandemic. And I think the same thing also happened with St. Eustatius in 2018.
Mm-hmm.
So you see all of these different types of machinations. Instead of 2010 being the moment where the living standard is raised on all of the islands, it becomes a moment when it actually goes downwards. Or at least from my reading, let me put it that way.
Yeah.
Quincy, can I say
Yeah.
something really quick? Because I think it's important for anyone who's watching this to understand that what happened, especially, I mean, as a station, I feel really strongly about what happened in 2018 when the parliament in the Netherlands decided that the local government, the island council could no longer function and therefore had to be dismantled. And that is what happened in 2018. I thought,
Mm-hmm.
we should know that clearly.
Hmm.
I want everyone to understand that um these decisions that the Netherlands made, it all honestly from the outside looking in would have seemed as if they were all sensible. And if you look at what happened in Irma, you would say, but yeah, the government, the money was going missing, so they should have done this and that. But I want to make it clear that the goalpost constantly changes in the Dutch Caribbean. I hear one thing in the second chamber, and then I'm hearing and I'm confused,
Hmm.
Mm-hmm.
or it is that they say one thing, but then make you jump through so many hoops that it's it's near impossible. And then you think things like, why can't we have a social minimum
Hmm.
just set up? Because it's not rocket science. We learn how to do that in economics in Harvard too. And somehow it can't be done here on St. Eustatius. I want to be clear that it's important for people to understand the perspective of the people living here
Hmm.
versus what you're being told, because what you're being told sounds right. I will not pretend as if I haven't listened to the parliament, as if I haven't had conversations with Mr. Knops. But in 2018, really quickly, there was a conversation about the takeover on the island, and there was a question about safety for the people who they were going to send to the island. And every person in the Caribbean who knows about St. Eustatius knows that we have a crime rate of petty theft
Hmm.
and maybe some domestic violence, but we don't have issues like we're gonna go kill people. That's not us. We don't have a murder rate. It just doesn't exist or something like that. We don't
Mm-hmm.
we
But
don't commit these crimes,
mm-hmm.
but everyone in the second chamber had questions about safety, one of the safest places on the planet.
But this is what I
Can
want to ask you all as well. So I want to ask all of the panelists as well, because I feel sometimes that there's very much so a disconnect between what happens on the islands and persons making decisions around the island. So when somebody asked me, like, is it possible for somebody from the Netherlands to represent the best islands? And we're talking about the best islands in particular, because of course we know first of all that the Cast Islands have a very different structure, so they have the minister plenipotentiaries, all of that kind of stuff. For the best islands is the local government and kingdom relations, etc. But can someone in the second chamber who does not have a background from the islands really accurately represent life on the islands or speak for them? And like for me, the answer is no. Like there is a disconnect, because it's almost as the same thing as me going to Amsterdam, living for a couple of months somewhere, and then saying like, okay, I can make decisions for the people in Amsterdam or in a particular a particular area of Amsterdam even. And so I wonder, how do we articulate these things? Because I don't think it's for lack of our governments trying per se to articulate grievances or areas in which they want to have help, et cetera, et cetera. How is it possible? How do we actually go about, because BIJ, we have our ideas for sure, and also in our party platform, but how is it that we can adequately tell them, like, listen, no, the way that you speak about the islands, especially within the kingdom, is very, very wrong. And the way that you speak about the islands actually at the United Nations and at other international organizations are actually more correct, right? So that you actually benefit from the island also being a part of the kingdom, from the islands also being a part of the Netherlands. How do we start shifting that narrative on the ground amongst our own people as one? And then also in the Netherlands, where people, some of them don't even know about the islands and the fact that St. Maarten, St. Eustatius, Saba, and of course, the ADC islands are still part of the kingdom.
Can I pose a question here? Because
Yes,
this is
go ahead.
something that's been around, like swirling around my mind for a while. Because
Okay.
in the Netherlands, there is a lack of a voice from the Dutch Caribbean, if I may
Mhm.
say so. And would it be as simple? Because I know if I compare to the United States, places like Puerto Rico, Washington, D.C., they have representation in the House of Representatives.
Mhm.
Would it be as simple as having a special member attached from each of the islands in the second chamber? What is your thoughts about this? Do you think it's as simple as that kind of solution?
Yes.
And attached to that, what would be the
Mhm.
challenges of having this go through?
Well, for me, I think it would be, in principle, as simple as that, except that then we have to go back still again to this dismantling of the colonial structure. Because, so for example, one of the things people always ask me, they're like, okay, Lysanne, you're campaigning in English. Why aren't you campaigning in Dutch? If you go to the second chamber, you have to speak Dutch. And I'm always like, okay, when I get to the second chamber, trust me, I'm going to oefen more, and I'm going to durf because it's required, and I'm going to speak the Dutch that I know I can speak. But I feel like when you do that and when you actually reinforce that colonial structure, so to speak, you exclude a whole number of people from the SSS Islands and also even from Aruba, Bonaire, and Curacao, where Papiamento is the language. So I say it's as simple as that, which I think it should happen. We should reach to a point where we say, like, listen, the Netherlands and the kingdom is not monocultural. We have to actually look at the reality on the ground and make adjustments for the reality on the ground. But then we have to go a step further and say, we don't just want to say people come to the table. We want to say you are valued and welcome here at the table. And that means actually also including language, including ideas around origins and education and all of these different things that have to be disrupted. Quinsy, you want to answer, or anybody else want to jump in? Mr. Jessurun?
Mr.
Yes.
Jessurun first. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think that we have to start thinking based on human rights. Quinsy, you did very well by explaining that in 1948, the United Nations came with this Universal Declaration on Human Rights and the Charter of the United Nations, where actually they wanted to make an end to colonialism. we are still in an era of decolonization because still this part of the Caribbean is being colonized. And there are also some uh, British and some French territories, yeah, that are still colonized territories. You can try to give it another name, but the bottom line is that we have the right as a people to be free from colonialism. And that is one of the important rights in the right of self-determination. It is explicitly the first article in the International Covenant for Civil and Political Rights, as well as economic, social, and cultural rights. Now, the whole discussion for the 400,000 Antillians, we have 200,000 here in this part of the kingdom, and we have the other 200,000 living in the Netherlands. They have the right to self-determination. But what is happening is that we use the colonial nationality and we use the colonial structures to voice our opinions. But we have the right to say we want our own structures, we want our own identity represented, and so we want to have our own representatives that take political decisions. And we, as instead of going with the one man, one vote Dutch colonial concept, we want to see the one man, one vote Antillean concept in this part of the territory. And I want to give you one more detail that is important, that is not being included in all the discussions of why we should be Antillians. The territory, the Netherlands Antilles, that colonial territory as it was before, Curaçao and onderhorigheden, it was a territory with minerals, with a lot of economic potential. And what did the Dutch do? Against the principle of dividing the territory, they accepted self-determination for the island populations. That is how all these votings came about and these referendums came about, which all were illegal, which all were against the human rights treaties and the human rights resolutions that tell you that it is together, all these 400,000 have a right. They decide what they want with their economic potential. Right now it is split up. And guess what? The Dutch is saying the Saba Bank is for Holland. It is theirs, is from the Netherlands. And a fisherman here in Sint Maarten, if he wants to fish on the Saba Bank, which was possible before, now he has to pay, and he is being shafted, he's being sent away when he is arriving on the Saba Bank. Just to name, give a difference. When you talk with people in Sint Maarten and you ask them, okay, what is it that we are left with since 10, then it is clearly that they say, well, we don't have any more much minerals and potential in our island. And when we look at the territorial waters, we have been cut off and curtailed because the Netherlands now has a lot of it. And what are we left with it? And then one simple question. I am a senior citizen, and all the senior citizens that I know, they have either worked in Curaçao or in Aruba. And they have helped the economy from the Netherlands Antilles. It was not the economy from Aruba. It was not, it was for the whole territory. We all have benefited. Money was sent back home to support the families. And what happened? Now the Arubian will tell you, but the gas between Venezuela and Aruba, that's for me. And the Curaçaoan will tell you, yeah, but the gas that we have in this territory, which is now split up, that's for us. And so what you want to say, that all these people, these seniors and their families that have assisted as Antillian to build up this territory and actually provide services to the colonial power, they have now to get the shortest end of the stick. No way, Jose.
So
that's
so
what you say.
Would it be fair to say then that a lot of the internal, or not even, but a lot of the intrinsic problems or challenges were not well thought out before this current system that we are in came about. That's one. And then two, because for me, indeed, going back to the question that Dimetri posed, and yes, I understood that you mean non-voting reps or people who could speak for the islands. I definitely still think that's a start. But I think that indeed, like there's conversations that are still supposed to be happening between the islands that now are not necessarily happening. And everything went so quickly, even though there was a whole 10-year period, lots and lots of things went so quickly that people couldn't really get ahead of it, right? And then what you hear is like, oh, but you should have known that. So for example, even the situation in the Caribbean Netherlands with the pension where a mistake was made, which means that there was not enough funds in the pension fund. So then pension had to be cut from people who were not even getting that great a pension already. They had to start doing with a lot less. And then the response was like, you should have accounted better, not owing to the fact that it was also a learning process, you know. And so for me, I think, again, how do we now go from a position of saying like, this is what we have and we have to accept it, to saying like, no, we press for more. We want more. Indeed, because I always say like the Netherlands is a champion for human rights and for you know, across the world. And now we want to say, bring that same energy within the kingdom and within the country of the Netherlands. And let's talk about it as it pertains to these critical conversations for the islands. I know like BIJ1 has its own ideas around that, including giving the islands much more of a voice, and giving some of the autonomy back to the islands so that they can be a part of the decision making. But what is it like for you guys? Because we only have about 15 minutes more. What will it take to get Caribbean people, Dutch Caribbean people, to see each other and to engage in the necessary conversations that we need to have amongst ourselves and then with the Netherlands?
Well, I think.
Oh, go
Quincy,
ahead.
you can go though.
Well, I think in that sense, we need to be doing what we're doing now, and we need to cut the Netherlands out. We need to be having these conversations amongst each other without centering around what the Netherlands want, what the Netherlands is doing. We need to look at what exactly are overlapping interests. How do we come together, not within structures that were decided for us, but that we decide? So what Mr. Jessurun was talking about in the way of the one voice, one vote, one person, one vote for Caribbean style, I think it needs to come back to that sense of collectivity, which doesn't come from a colonial mindset, but comes from us seeking each other out to fight that colonial mindset. And those are two different things. Because if we talk about the Netherlands Antilles as a concept in and of itself, it was foisted upon us. These were structures that we never actually chose for. These were structures that were given to us and that we had to operate within. So when thinking about how do you make that yours, it can never become yours because we didn't come up with it. And I think what we have now is we have the opportunity to think again, like what exactly do we want and how exactly do we achieve that together? Because as Mr. Jessurun also said, is this notion of collectively by traveling between the islands, we built up all of the islands together. And I think that's something that's always forgotten. I remember hearing a conversation also on Sint Maarten about like who's the real Sint Maartener. And I kept thinking to myself, how can you have a conversation about who's the real Sint Maartener when the majority of the island consists of migrants, right? When the whole thing about traveling between the islands is what makes us great, is what makes us strong, because we learn from each other and we grow from that. And then when thinking around the idea of representation in the second chamber, I think that would be a step backwards because that would include us within the colonial system instead of actually seeing the autonomy of the islands as something that should be seen on its own. We should not be included within the Netherlands and within that structure. We should be equal partners alongside the Netherlands, as the Kingdom Statute tells us that we are, right?
Well, I think we gotta differentiate again between the best and the cast, because the best islands are currently a part of the Netherlands, and I feel underrepresented in terms of conversation in the
Definitely.
second chamber. So I did, of course, I agree with you where it comes to the Cast Islands. We need to be seen as equal partners in the kingdom, but we also know that as much as we say that we're equal partners, we don't operate as equal partners. That definitely one of the equal partners has a bulk or a majority of power in the kingdom dynamics. But definitely, as it pertains to the best, I think it's very important for representation to happen at that level. And I tell people, like for me, today it's me on Bain and hopefully also in other elections. But also, I think it should be more and more and more and more and more people from the best islands saying like, no, we are a part of this process. We want to be on the ballots. We want to be on parties. We want the best to be included in party programs and in conversations and decision making at the highest level, for sure. So I think that's also something that we have to always keep in perspective, that we're actually talking about two very different constellations, and then but still that those two have to talk to each other. So the best islands still have to talk to the Cast Islands, and the Cast Islands still have to talk to the best islands. And right now, I feel like sometimes a lot gets lost in the political bureaucracy, so to speak, and it disadvantages islanders from finding each other and seeing each other. But okay, I talked a lot.
I want to go back to this distinction between the best and the cast, because I think that is what actually is stopping a lot of development, because we're seen as opponents, as antagonists. I think a lot of things that we see within the Netherlands is the way how these islands are played out against each other.
Yes.
Okay.
I
Okay, let me. Urisha go first. Urisha go first. Oh,
Quinsy,
sorry?
I have to stop you. I
Yeah,
feel as
good.
if I don't know, I don't want to sound, but I feel like you've been missing some years here, because I truly believe that the ABC Islands and the SSS Islands do not belong together. I'm going to say it because my mom was born on Aruba. My sister lives there. And my God, the culture there is completely different. Bonaire people are in no way like Sabans and Stations. We do not belong together in a way that was forced on us. Now, if I look at St. Maarten has much more in common with St. Eustatius and Saba. St. Maarten, St. Eustatius, and Saba belong together. The problem that we have is that St. Maarten can't see that. Period. It's not as if Statia does not and Saba does not commit to like spending a ton of money on St. Maarten, for instance, with in the medical field. It's not as if Saba doesn't have much to offer with the Saba Bank. It's not as if Statia doesn't have much to offer. The problem is St. Maarten can't see it. I'll be clear and I'll be frank, because we can see it. We've been doing it. But with their leadership and with their mindset, and I don't think this has anything to do with Dutch. I think we often fail by blaming people who had nothing to do with it. They did this on their own. We did this on our own. The rift that we've created was of our own making. I think that it's unfair to blame anyone else when I can see it. At 10 years old, I saw this. I don't understand how we can't see it now, years later. I was one of the last people, I was the last person to touch the Antillean flag on, because we took it down here on Statia. And I remember that day saying, wow, I'm never going to sing that anthem again. But there is a bit of, though some say sweet Antilles, some say Dushi and Tiata, I didn't know what that meant. And I'm never
But
going to understand it.
because we have like 7 minutes left, so I just want to. So I definitely see where both of you have relevant points, but I do think, and that's part of the quandary of our relationships with each other. I think, because listen, I think familial or family wise, definitely there are strong connections between the SSS Islands and the ABC Islands. There's strong connection. We've been everywhere. We are everywhere. we're always moving between each other. But politically, there's been a lot of divide. And I think that's again part of this colonial structure that we've inherited. So we have 6 minutes, and we will touch on a bunch of different stuff. But I want to just say, okay, I want to give Jonathan a chance to speak after Dimetri. So Dimetri, you're gonna go first. Give Jonathan a chance to speak, and then we actually have a question that I want Quinsy to touch on before we wrap up. So Dimetri, go first, then we'll go to Jonathan, and then to Mr. Jessurun, and then we'll wrap up.
Because I think in this whole discussion that we had for about the last 10 minutes, we are conflating family ties and identity. While we have strong connections with the other islands, there was not really a nation building process within the Antilles for all of those years. The same anthem that you spoke about, Urisha, that was only made in 2000. We were the only generations who could sing it. And that was only after the process of the Antilles almost breaking up in the early 90s. So when you talk about how do we create connections between seeing ourselves as Antillians, we have to start that process because it was started half-heartedly and it was never completed. We don't see each other outside of in the Netherlands when we're a minority. We don't see each other as Antillians, really. It's only when we have a common enemy that they're enemy, quote unquote, that we are Antillians. For the rest of the times, we are Sabans, Sint Maarteners, etc. And that is something we have to overcome.
Yeah. Jonathan?
Sure. This has been really interesting just listening. So all of the back and forth. I think there's a lot of points being raised. It really seems as if colonialism is really something. Like the number that it has done on us and our family and cultural ties. I somewhat agree with you, Risha. I mean, my dad is from Bonaire. So when she says Bonaire has nothing to do with Sint Maarten, I was like, she's kind of right with that. Like there's very cultural norms in the ABC Islands versus Sint Maarten and Statia. But then I think Lysanne touched on something that was really interesting. She said people need to recognize that the kingdom is multifaceted and multicultural. And it's like something as basic as that. Like people in the Netherlands need to know that there's a multicultural kingdom. And I think that we also need to talk about why we were colonized in the first place. I feel like that's a conversation that needs to be had. Like, why is it that the Netherlands colonized Sint Maarten? Why did they colonize Curaçao? Why did they colonize Statia? Why did they colonize Saba? And why are we still colonized? So all of these things are conversations that need to be in an educational platform so that people have access to these things. Because
yes, and on both sides of the Atlantic.
Right? Why do we speak English and why does Bonaire speak Papiamento? Like, let's talk about that. Why are there language differences? Because you don't learn a language because you want to learn a language. You learn a language because you need to learn a language. Your mother tongue is not chosen. Your mother tongue is based on the language you need to survive based on your surroundings. It's not like I grew up choosing not to speak Dutch as my first language. Like there's a reason that was the case. And so I think that we're just floating up there, we're not really grabbing them, taking a hold of them, addressing them in this very important conversation. And then the whole question is like, okay, should we even be further integrating into the Netherlands, like the Best Islands, for example? Like, how are those not considered colonies? And then talking about the charter, the UN charter, part of the responsibility of the colonizer is to ensure that they give the tools of decolonization to their colonies. So it's not just a matter of saying, okay, now you're free. They need to ensure that they have the tools and the proper process in place to decolonize. So it's like, what is the responsibility of the Netherlands in decolonization? What does decolonization even mean for BES, for Cass Islands? What are we talking about when we say decolonization? Is it a matter of autonomy? Is it a matter of training? Is it a what? I feel there's there's so much that we are just barely scraping the surface here, barely, and it's like you're operating within a system that was not made for you to succeed. So what are we doing? I don't know.
Yeah, I think these are some of the fundamental questions that we are challenged with as Caribbean islanders, but also Caribbean islanders in the diaspora, right? So those in the Netherlands who also are confronted with it in a very different way on the ground in the in the Netherlands. And I feel like that's part of the things like beyond BIJ1, beyond other political parties or whatever. Like, how do we, as 400,000 strong, find each other and say, like, listen, there are things that we have to address. There are things that we need to discuss amongst ourselves, and not just around this time. And of course, I'm very happy that we can connect, during this political campaign. But also, I know, Jonathan, you're doing Melee. How do we actually link that to something bigger for people in the diaspora and people on the islands to actually find each other? I think these are the conversations and questions that we have to keep having. So we're at 7 o'clock, but I'm going to beg the typist for 1 minute, the interpreter for 1 minute, to just give each of you like 30 seconds to just say something in closing about the conversation that we've had. Hopefully we'll have more of these conversations because BIJ1 definitely plans to stay active in the region, in the Caribbean region, beyond next week. So 30 seconds. I'll start with Mr. Jessurun. Any last words for us and for the audience members, things that we should take into consideration?
Well, the discussion showed that we are not BIJ1. We are not one yet. We have to come together. And so I think that the follow-up, I will welcome it. I will be part of it because I saw that we are not one because of not being knowledgeable with what has to unite us. We are talking about differences instead of looking at what is uniting us and what it is that the international community has provided us to stand for and to have.
Okay, thank you. Dimitri, I'll let you go next.
Yes. So in closing, there was something I wanted to talk about earlier. I think Quinsy actually brought it up when he was talking about 1954 and the forming of the Netherlands Antilles, and everything that he talked about. To me, it seems like the post-colonial problem, and I saw it when I was doing academic research in West Africa, that he said the Netherlands Antilles structure was hoisted upon us. We were inherited a country that had artificial borders, language barriers, developmental inequalities, artificial political structures. So I think when it comes to BIJ1 or even any discussion going forward, it's not only how do we deconstruct the colonial legacy, but how do we deconstruct the post-colonial legacy? Because some of the things that were issues in the past have continued on in the Antilles, and that created a whole new set of problems.
Right, right. Okay.
That's my
thank you very much, Ms. Blake.
For me, I want it to be clear to everyone that I truly believe in the strength of unity. And I think what we need to be doing moving forward is figuring out how to deal with what we have and how to move forward in changing what we have within the system of what we have got, because I really do think it's possible. And I think that if we put our heads together and if we truly start to stand up and really inform people, not just in the Caribbean, but especially in the Netherlands, about the way things truly are here, I do think that the people of the Netherlands will see that this is against our human rights and that is not what they want for their fellow men.
Jonathan?
Sure. I truly believe the imagination of us as Caribbean people as it comes to our liberation. I mean, I feel like the systems right now that we're operating within, again, they were not made for us. We were not meant to succeed in them. There's a lot of hoops that we have to jump through. There's a lot of games that we have to play. And honestly, I don't think we are equipped because we're playing a game that was not made by us. And you're always going to lose when someone else makes the game. The game is rigged. And so I would really say, as much as BIJ1 is fighting the good fight and making sure that there's representation, for the Caribbean Netherlands. It's really important for the people in the Caribbean Netherlands to make sure that they're imagining a future for themselves that they want to see. Like, who are we? What is our identity? Who do we want to be? Where do we want to go? This idea of vision and not having a future decided for you by an outside entity is extremely important. And we need to start imagining the way forward because that's the only way we're going to get where we want.
Yeah, thank you. Quincy, quickly.
Um, I'd like to say that this notion of imagining the way forward is especially something that I've been working on the last year, and actually longer, if I'm honest. It's thinking through the ways in which resistance, refusal, marronage is part of Caribbean culture and is part of the cultures of resistance that we have inherited and that sometimes we also use in different ways. So I'm working at the moment on Carnival and the ways in which Carnival has been pivotal for bringing communities from the Dutch Caribbean together in the Netherlands. And I'm thinking that's a really interesting way of thinking forward. Like, how can we connect that on the islands when I'm listening to what's going on now? There's a creativity there. There's a way of thinking about economics there. There's a way of thinking about travel, about migration. There's a way of thinking about the past and the future, which I think is really interesting to put forward within this group. And hopefully we get to take that on to the next couple of conversations that we will definitely have, because I think this was really fun. And I'm looking forward to learning more as we go um, on this journey forward.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And my final comments are this. For me, I think it is super important indeed that we find unity and solidarity amongst ourselves as islanders. And that means on Saba, on Statia, on St. Maarten, Aruba, Curacao, Bonaire, but also with each other and with the Dutch Caribbean diaspora. And so that's why I tell people, for me, it's super important that people turn up to vote. No, voting is not the solution. It is part of a solution because you still need to get involved in your organizations on the ground. You still need to have the conversations on the ground on a grassroots level, engage people, be in activism, whatever your expertise or your interest is, get involved in the organizations there. Let us find each other in those organizations over and beyond our differences so that we can actually work together. But politically, voting is a tool. And I tell people all the time when they speak to me, of course, I would love it if you vote for BIJ1 and I would love it if you throw it for number 13. But beyond that, I would love it if everybody got up on the 15th, 16th, and 17th and went to vote, because if they see that Dutch Caribbean people are voting and Dutch Caribbean islanders in the diaspora are voting, we become a different kind of political influence. And I really wish that for my Dutch Caribbean people. And that's what I have to say. I'm so thankful that we finally got to have this discussion, which was in the making for a long time. And I hope that we actually are able to have at least one or two more of these throughout the year. So I hope that you guys don't mind if I call on you again, even post-election, so that we can talk some more. Continue doing all of the good work that you are doing and you have been doing over the years in your respective fields. And thank you for joining me. And good night. And all of you all listening as well, good night. And thank you for joining us.